Breaking news this morning, a grandfather has died and dozens more have been injured.
One passenger on the flight told Reuters that the drop was very dramatic and that everyone not wearing a seatbelt was launched into the ceiling.
All right, in today's video, we're going to talk about Singapore Flight SQ321, a Boeing 777 operated by Singapore Airlines, which was en route from London to Singapore when it encountered what's believed to be severe turbulence. There were 211 passengers and 18 crew members on board, and very sadly, there's been one death on board. Today, Friday, 3 days after the incident, there's still 46 passengers and 2 crew members receiving treatment in hospital, and 22 of those originally had spinal injuries. 6 were in critical condition. So today I want to touch on what caused this incident, if in fact it was clear air turbulence and in-flight turbulence. I want to talk about some of the mechanics behind that, some of the aerodynamic factors at play, and some other causes that can lead to in-flight upsets and that have related or that have resulted in in-flight accidents and injury to passengers in the last couple of years. Finally, I want to touch on seatbelt policy, and I want to touch on a rule of thumb we can use if we're choosing not to wear it or not to wear it for short periods. And it's really a risk-based approach that pilots and flight crew will use in making in-flight risk decisions. G'day and welcome back. If you're new to the channel, I'm Matthew Dank. I'm a former Australian Air Force and Navy pilot, having spent my career flying H-60 Seahawk helicopters and also C-17-3 Globemaster heavy jet transport aircraft around the world. I have recently joined an Australian airline, returned to flying after a couple of years out of the cockpit. In this series, we talk about aviation performance, learning, and mental health and fitness tips for pilots. Today's video really is a broader piece than just for pilots. It's about the issue and the incidents we find with in-flight turbulence effects and what is really one of the causes of major injuries for passengers that probably doesn't get the attention it should, other than when there's incidents like we've seen in the last couple of days. So let's have a look at what happened with Singapore Flight SQ321 in terms of its performance. So let's take a look at the route of the flight from London through to Singapore. In fact, the aircraft was late in its flight when the cabin crew were preparing and, in fact, serving their breakfast service, and the aircraft struck what's believed to be severe turbulence. At the time of the incident, the Boeing 777 was cruising at 37,000 feet. And as we can see from the altitude data here presented by FlightAware, the aircraft dipped quite suddenly, about 75 feet, before rapidly gaining altitude. The aircraft topped out at about 37,400 feet before descending back and regaining altitude at 37,000 feet. Within about 90 seconds, the incident was over, and rapid rates of acceleration can be seen in the cabin as depicted by videos and as clearly depicted by the amount of damage sustained to the cabin of the aircraft. So this really was one of the more violent episodes of in-flight turbulence or aircraft upset seen in recent years. It's not often that you see injuries to this extent. It's not often that you see this degree of damage. And luckily, it's very, very rare that we see in-flight deaths from turbulence events. So I want to take a brief look at some of the turbulence factors that can cause this type of incident. And I'm going to refer to this report by the National Transportation Safety Board in the US, released in 2011, which is about preventing turbulence-related injuries in air carrier operations under Part 121. So Part 121 covers typical air transport jets that you're likely to fly in. So in terms of turbulence types, this diagram, whilst fairly basic, gives a good breakdown. I think on the right here, we've got convective activity. So this is a thunderstorm, a side-on view from the base of the thunderstorm here through to the very tops. And you can see the downdrafts here associated with turbulence and the sort of thunderstorm effects you'll find around your house or suburbs when they're active in the vicinity. On the left here, we can see mountain wave type effects caused by high terrain and high wind speeds. This is the sort of thing you'll see very much so in the northwestern US over the Rockies, less so in Australia. But in this case, you can get mountain wave turbulence up to very high levels through the atmosphere. The third type here I'd like to highlight is the jet stream effect, and this is caused by the jet stream itself. I've got a good diagram here which will illuminate that. So clearly visible here is the jet stream over continental Australia and the forecast area of clear air turbulence to the south. This is a US Federal Aviation Administration advisory on clear air turbulence avoidance. And the background here talks about sudden severe turbulence occurring in cloudless regions that cause violent buffeting of the aircraft. The most comprehensive definition being high altitude turbulence encountered outside of convective clouds. The reason why that is important outside convective clouds is it can be very hard to see turbulence that's not associated with convective clouds or thunderstorms or other events that are likely to come to a pilot's attention. 5.2 says CAT is a recognised problem that affects all aircraft operations. CAT is especially troublesome because it is often encountered unexpectedly and frequently without visual cues to warn pilots of the hazards. Now, one of the big features we have on the aircraft for seeing turbulence related to thunderstorm activity is the aircraft weather radar, and it only depicts turbulence coming from the movement of water droplets. That's how the weather radar actually works and functions. So if there's no water, the radar is not going to perform any role for us. It's not going to help us at all, and we're left to using other features and other systems. Other sorts of turbulence we're likely to encounter is mechanical turbulence, similar to what we saw or discussed about in the US coming off high terrain like mountains, so on the downwind or leeward side of those mountains, and also wake turbulence, which is common in takeoff and landing type events, where vortices are generated or wake turbulence is generated from other aircraft, and also at high levels where we're passing below other aircraft, particularly if they're higher than us, or heavier than us, I should say. So this is something we can avoid. We can avoid terrain-related mechanical turbulence because we know where the terrain is. We know where other aircraft are typically. We know where the wake turbulence is. But clear air turbulence can be quite hard to pin down exactly where it is, despite us as pilots receiving some warnings of them, normally in the form of SIGMETs or significant weather advisories. So 0.6.1 says that one of the principal areas where CAT is found is in the vicinity of jet streams. Jet streams are relatively narrow bands of strong wind in the upper levels of the atmosphere. So let's take a quick look at jet streams. Okay, Wikipedia has an entry here on jet streams with an animation of the west to easterly flow over the continental USA. So jet streams are fast-flowing, meandering air currents in the atmosphere of Earth and other planets. On Earth, the main jet streams are located near the altitude of the tropopause. This is where the temperature of the atmosphere stops decreasing with altitude, and they flow from the west to east. Typically, there's a polar and a subtropical jet, as we can see, and they're product of two factors: the atmospheric heating by solar radiation from the sun, and also the Coriolis force acting on the moving air mass due to the rotation of the Earth on its axis. So a depiction here of the jet stream over the continental US again, thanks to Fox Weather. And this is also responsible for the dramatically different flight times you'll experience when flying across the continent from east to west or west to east. Certainly in Australia, flying from Perth to Sydney, for example, is a much faster journey than flying the other way, and that is due to these jet streams. And the jet stream can move at greater than 100 knots, so 100 nautical miles per hour, which is quite significant. Right, this diagram gives good insight into those wind differences. You can see the jet core here, 130 knots. Outside the core, you're dropping down to 40 knots and above 40 knots. So what's that? A 90 knot difference within the core of the jet. And another diagram here of it circulating the Earth with the polar and the subtropical jet. Lastly, this diagram here gives a good indication of its 3D presentation, typically in almost a tunnel type structure. But the exact location can be quite hard to discern by pilots just due to the lack of identifiable information or sensing available on the aircraft or even in forecast products. For that reason, it's something that's often a threat, it's often something that can occur in the background unexpectedly. And for these reasons, clear air turbulence associated with jet streams is something that we cannot reliably identify, certainly not to the degree that we would be able to for something like wake turbulence or thunderstorm-related turbulence. Clear air turbulence is just harder to track down, it's harder to pin down, and it's something that's often going to be a threat in the background, albeit at a low level and a low likelihood. Okay, going back to the NTSB Safety Research Report here on preventing turbulence-related injuries. Looking at the executive summary, one key thing to highlight here is the data collected from 2009 through to 2018, so a 9-year period, indicate that turbulence-related accidents account for more than 1/3 of all accidents on board aircraft. So if you're going to be injured in an airline-related accident or incident, about 1/3 of those are going to be related to in-flight turbulence, which is really quite large. Now, this diagram from the same report indicates flight crew awareness of turbulence risk. So aware is likely to be, again, thunderstorms, likely to be wake turbulence or mechanical turbulence related to terrain. Unaware or unknown or not reported is likely to be something like clear air turbulence, where we're just unsure whether it's going to occur and it's caught us by surprise. In terms of the general prevalence of turbulence-related accidents, you can see here the general accident rate in total is declining over time, particularly around the 2001-2002 period onwards, but the turbulence-related accident rate is quite steady over time from about 1989 through to 2018. This diagram gives a good insight into the causes of accidents by turbulence type. So you've got convective, again relating to thunderstorms predominantly. You've got wake turbulence relating to other aircraft transiting nearby. mountain wave relating to high terrain and high wind speeds, and then clear air, with clear air being the type that we're most likely to stumble upon unalerted and unaware. In terms of sustaining injuries, unfortunately, flight attendants who are usually getting around the cabin doing their job are far more likely to be injured than passengers. And these injuries can occur at different times during a cabin crew member's duties and service, but the predominant one here is preparing the cabin for landing on descent. Now, as you would imagine, if you're wearing your seatbelt, you're far less likely to sustain serious injuries. This part of the report indicates that from 1980 to 2003, only 4 people who were seated with seatbelts fastened received serious injuries during turbulence. And that's without including cases of other people falling onto and injuring properly secured occupants. So by far and away, a seatbelt is your greatest protective measure. Again, here for injuries sustained by flight attendants and passengers, you can see those wearing seatbelts were dramatically less likely to be injured. One thing I know many passengers are concerned about in these types of events is the likelihood of the airplane itself breaking apart or an aircraft accident affecting the entire aircraft. And the likelihood of that is in fact very low indeed. Here is some video and an image of a Boeing 787 being stress tested during its design and certification process. You can see here the wing root, you can see here the wing tip stretching all the way up. And I understand that is in the order of 25 feet or 7.6 meters. So this test is designed to put the aircraft through 150%, so 50% more than the greatest in-flight loading you could expect that aircraft to face. So a very large load indeed, and as you can see, those wings are holding up quite nicely. And this video covers the stress testing of a Airbus A350, a similar type of regime, and as you can see, a very robust airframe indeed. Okay, now I'll touch on a couple of other incidents that have occurred in the last 15 years or so, one being a incident earlier this year in a LATAM flight from Sydney to Santiago, Chile, with a stopover in Auckland Airport. Here, about 2 hours into the flight, the aircraft, which was a Boeing 787, experienced an in-flight upset. It dropped suddenly and lost about 300 feet of altitude. Of the 272 people on board the aircraft, 50 were injured and 12 taken to hospital after the landing in Auckland. Reports here indicate about 30 to 40 people hit the ceiling of the cabin, damaging multiple ceiling panels. And one person recalls being thrown back up to 4 or 5 seat rows. Boeing issued a memo reminding the airlines to inspect the cockpit chairs or 787 aircraft for loose switches, as it's understood that the involuntary or uncommanded movement of a pilot's seat was involved in this incident, noting the accident report is yet to be released. So there has been some reports of the pilot's seat moving forward and impeding the flight controls, causing autopilot disconnect. Okay, the third and distinct incident I'll point out here is a 2008 incident involving a Qantas A330 en route from Singapore to Perth, which suddenly pitched nose down, losing altitude. Now, this was caused by a very rare flight control and air data computer malfunction. Air data computer being the device which measures the airspeed and air pressure and translates those signals or those values into digital signals for the flight computer and other systems on board the aircraft. So in a very unusual and rare situation, the system malfunctioned, resulting in a nose-down pitch moment of the aircraft. So aircraft was in straight and level flight, elevators commanded nose-down pitch, and as you can imagine, passengers on board who were not secured were propelled into the ceiling of the cabin. So quite a violent incident here and quite a large amount of damage inside the aircraft cabin. Of note, the maximum nose-down pitch attitude was about 8.4 degrees, which is really quite large and much larger than the aircraft would be pitched to in a normal descent. This point here is also worth noting. During the upset, the flight data recorder recorded the peak vertical acceleration of negative 0.80 G. So ordinarily, you're suspended in your seat. I am right now by 1 G pushing downwards. In this case, there were almost that amount pushing upwards, so 0.8 G, so quite a large acceleration force of any unrestrained objects towards the ceiling of that cabin, which certainly would have resulted in a forceful contact with the ceiling. Interestingly, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau report into this incident indicates that 6 passengers reported that they were in fact strapped in by their seatbelts at the time of the upset, but the belt became unfastened and did not restrain them in the seats. Now these seatbelts, in fact 51 other seatbelts, were investigated and technically found to be fully serviceable, so there were no problems identified with those seatbelts at all. Interestingly, investigators also identified that the seatbelt, if it was fastened very loosely, could be inadvertently opened due to the belt catching on the underside of the seat's right armrest. Seatbelts that were loosely fastened posed a significant risk of injury, even if they remained fastened, something interesting to note. Of the 303 passengers on board, a total of 12 sustained serious injuries, 107 minor, and 196 none or unknown. Now, why is the rapid change in airspeed such a major factor in the force felt in the cabin of an aircraft? Well, one reason due to horizontal shear, or an aircraft flying in with no vertical upwards movement, is simply due to the lift equation and what that means for changes in aircraft airspeed. So lift equation is lift equals the coefficient of lift multiplied by 1/2 the density of the air, multiplied by the velocity of the air squared, and by the surface area of the wing. So without getting into too much technical detail here, we're going to focus on one thing in particular, and that's the velocity squared. So for an aircraft traveling twice its designated airspeed, so going from, let's say, 150 knots up to 300 knots, the lift would in fact increase by a factor of 4. The lift is in fact very sensitive to changes in airspeed. For that reason, moving in and out of high-speed air bodies like in a jet stream can result in rapid changes in lift and rapid changes in the ability of the wings to support the load of the aircraft. Other factors, of course, are vertical shear, so a body of air moving upwards or downwards. If you think to yourself of being in a moving elevator, coming down from a high building, as it decelerates and slows down to stop at a ground floor, for example, the force felt through the floor of the aircraft is much the same as an aircraft moving into an upward moving body of air. So significant forces can occur, and of course, in the opposite sense, significant forces can force the fuselage of the aircraft down, and any unrestrained objects inside that fuselage will move upwards if the G is less than 0. Another way to think of that is if you're driving your vehicle down the motorway, let's say you're in the US or the UK, you're doing about 60 miles per hour, or in Australia 100 kilometers per hour, and you were to suddenly move the steering wheel to the side, any unsecure objects are going to get propelled towards the opposite side of the car. Now, if you increase the airspeed to the German Autobahn and you're doing double that, the force of that impact on the side of the vehicle will be even firmer. And in the case of modern jet transport aircraft, you're moving in the vicinity of 700 to 800 kilometers per hour. So much, much faster. An object of the same mass or the same weight, experiencing the same movement of the vehicle itself or the same movement of the aircraft, is going to be subject to a much higher force when impacting the side or the interior of that aircraft cabin. Okay, so we've looked at 3 different incidents. We've looked at a suspected clear air turbulence related in-flight incident. We've looked at a suspected seat malfunction causing a flight control impedance. And we've looked at a air data computer and a flight control computer related incident. Each of those caused an upset or a unexpected and rapid movement of the aircraft, causing personnel and people not restrained in that cabin to forcefully impact the cabin sides. So what I want to talk about now briefly is the seatbelt policy on board aircraft, and I want to talk about reasons and a tool you can use if deciding to come off the seatbelt and when to keep it off, when to put it back on. So the NTSB report shown earlier talks in detail about recommendations and some requests by air operators, that is airlines, for the seatbelt light and seatbelt sign to be shown continuously during cruise. And it was indicated in the report that that's just not practical to do. So the standing guidance, which is included in safety briefs in all airlines, is to maintain your seatbelt fastened at all times, regardless of whether or not the seatbelt sign is on. So let's look at a little principle from military aviation risk management, which can be applicable for passengers and for people in the cabin. And that's in regard to taking your seatbelt off and accepting what we've seen today is a higher risk. So clear air turbulence is something that can be encountered unexpectedly. It can be encountered potentially at any time in flight, even though the likelihood is low and the likelihood of severe injuries is quite rare. It is something that can happen. So one way to guard against that, clearly in line with airline policies, is to keep one's seatbelt fastened at all times. If the seatbelt's not fastened, we're going to be incurring some sort of risk. We're going to be taking some slightly increased risk of encountering injuries in the event that the aircraft does fly into in-flight turbulence. So a principle used in aviation risk management for military crews, certainly in Australia and allied nations, is the 3 principles of aviation risk management, and they are only take risk where the benefit outweighs the consequence. For example, if you're going to fly an aircraft at low altitude over terrain, you're more likely to encounter birds and bird strikes. You're more likely to potentially fly into power lines or other obstructions at low levels. So you'll You'll see that airlines just don't do this. You'll see that for most operators internationally, small aircraft are limited to not below 500 feet when not in built-up areas, and 1,000 feet when over built-up areas. But the military will fly much lower than this. But they don't do it willy-nilly. They don't do it without a reason. They only do it when there's a training benefit or an operational benefit or a mission benefit for doing so. So the potential benefit needs to outweigh the risk of doing that. In the event of taking off the seatbelt, yeah, there needs to be a reason. There needs to be a reason to visit someone, head to the bathroom, do something else, not just because we're relaxing, kicking back, enjoying the freedom of not having a seatbelt on. Not really a valid reason to do that in accordance with this principle. The second principle is don't take unnecessary risk. Just like the pilots won't fly the aircraft at low level just to check out the views, we won't go zooming past cities or geographical features or the pyramids of Giza or anything else just because it'd be nice to see a good, inspiring view out the window. That's not necessary to do, so we won't take those risks unnecessarily. Similarly, sitting back, seatbelt off, because one feels like it isn't really a good policy because it's not necessary. The seatbelt can easily be fastened. It might be slightly annoying for some people, but it's much safer, and it's an easy way to safeguard your physical safety when flying and the aircraft does encounter turbulence. And the third principle, which isn't really directly related or isn't directly usable for passengers in the aircraft cabin, is to make risk acceptance decisions at the appropriate level. So, for example, if the aircraft needs to do something which might be slightly more risky, that decision will be communicated forward amongst the crew, and that decision will be made by the aircraft captain. They have the experience and the delegation and authority to make that decision, whilst taking input and considering the thoughts and advice of all the other crew on board the aircraft. Similarly, for other sort of practices, that decision would be deferred off the aircraft and made in advance in terms of higher risks and the requirement to do other things. So that will be made by someone in flight operations or someone in the company, in the military, by a commanding officer or a more senior commander. And that's where operating rules, operating policies and procedures will be updated and will be written with that in mind. So lastly, something to note, and something from earlier this year, which I think is quite instrumental about aviation safety and the role of passengers in proactively safeguarding and even participating in safety of flight, is the story of JAL Flight 516, which back on the 2nd of January was an incident involving a A350 and a Coast Guard Dash 8. So the A350 from JAL landing into Tokyo, the aircraft impacted a Dash 8 on the runway, resulting in the destruction of the Airbus A350. So all 367 passengers and 12 aircrew were safely evacuated, although there were 15 injuries. And the critical point here is that none of the passengers appeared to have paused to retrieve hand luggage from overhead lockers. They listened to their JAL safety video, urging them to do exactly that, to leave your baggage when you evacuate. They took that on board wholeheartedly. Japan has a remarkable safety record in aviation, and part of the story here appears that the passengers followed the brief. They listened to the safety brief and they followed it to the letter of the law. And that was instrumental in everybody getting off the aircraft despite a serious fire and the destruction of that entire aircraft. So if that were the case, if passengers were to listen and understand that principle for wearing seatbelts in flight, understand the risk equation, understand that the seatbelt itself is effectively an insurance policy, then that would be a great way to safeguard the safety of everybody in the aircraft. So it remains to be seen how many passengers on Singapore SQ321 were wearing the seatbelt versus were not. My bet is that the majority that were seriously injured were not wearing their seatbelt. The lesson there is from previous flights and from Air Japan or from JAL 516 that listening to the safety brief and using safety measures, exactly as described by the crew, is the way to go. And I like to think of this really as an insurance policy. Last year, I enjoyed 2 flights to the UK and Europe on an Emirates aircraft, and on both occasions I needed to purchase travel insurance. It cost me several $100s to insure against illness, injury, loss of my baggage. Well, in the case of turbulence-related injuries, we can insure against that with one movement. Click, click, buckle up, seatbelt on at all times, and the risk of injury or worse due to turbulence or jet upsets is virtually zero. Okay, that's the video for today. That's the incident with Singapore Airlines SQ321 just 3 days ago. There's a couple of other incidents I've discussed whereby passengers were injured due to non-turbulence related upsets, and we've talked through seatbelt use, seatbelt policy, and importantly, a risk management principle you can use if you need to do something in the aircraft or accept greater risk. It's the same principle and rule of thumb that flight crew will use. That's it for me today. If you've experienced in-flight turbulence yourself and you've got a story to tell, please comment below. If you found this video particularly useful, I'd love to hear about it. Please comment. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon in my next video.